Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the book.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on September 15th, 2023 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, my usual housekeeping stuff, which is to remind you that you can listen to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast anytime via karmicevolution.com. And from there, you can scroll down the page and hear the most recent podcast or search the archived listings for past podcasts which you might have missed or to which you'd like to listen again. And the show drops every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern Time, but you can listen then or any time after. And while you're there, you'll see an offering for a free downloadable PDF titled How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which is free, friendly advice for every sun sign from renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest about what each of us, depending on our sun sign, needs to be happy. So be sure to grab that when you listen to this podcast, whether, again, you do so live or after the fact, and enjoy some words of astrological wisdom. Separately, you can always follow me on my Facebook page, Karmic Evolution for Your Soul, where you can keep track of upcoming podcast content and other astro news you can use. I post also, but not quite as frequently, on Instagram under karmic.evolution. So feel free to follow me there as well. And I'm offering still my discounted 75-minute Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, and this offer is for podcast listeners only. So if you're interested in astrology and you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart in order to gain greater consciousness about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, and you desire to move from chaos to clarity about what might be holding you back from achieving your most cherished desires in the areas of greatest interest to you, perhaps your relationships, your career and your job, your finances, and or your health, then this is the reading for you. It will look at how the energies into which you entered this lifetime may be keeping you stuck in old, habitual, soul-conditioned behavior or patterns, and how understanding this can assist you to make different, better, more positive choices moving forward. So if you'd like to co-create your own future happiness through astrological insight, it's actually pretty easy when you take advantage of this special discounted offer at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable. In addition, I will be teaching a class for the Astrological Society of Princeton titled Intro to Aspects, Learn How to Get to the Heart of the Chart, which will start October 15th and run through December 3rd. So if you've studied basic astrology, you know the meaning of the planets, the signs, and the houses, and now you're ready to take the next step, then this class is one you will want to take. Because it's only when astrology enthusiasts and students progress into the realm of learning how to interpret the meaning of aspects, or the relationship, angular, usually, relationship between planets in a chart, will they be able to decipher the fuller meaning of how an entire chart resonates with the life of that person. So if you become passionate about studying astrology, it becomes kind of imperative and also very exciting to understand how to delineate the major energies inherent in a chart to form a more whole and substantial picture. So if you'd like to step further into your astrological journey and better grasp the ultimate meaning of a chart's overall energies, then think about joining me, again, starting October 15th, and I'll help you hone your chart reading skills through this 8-week course, which again will run through December 3rd. We'll delve more deeply into the meaning of the major aspects: conjunctions, sextiles, squares, trines, oppositions, quincunxes, grand trines, grand crosses, and more, by studying the charts of well-known people to truly verify how they chose, or how they have currently chosen, to perceive and manifest the energies their chart depicts. So this will include a look at how similar aspects may actually manifest differently for different folks, which is sure to be enlightening in terms of learning the specific potential archetypal range of options in terms of how different individuals respond, some perhaps negatively and others positively, to their own inherent energies. So if you're interested in joining me for a journey into the beating heart of the chart, to deepen your chart reading skills and become a more impactful astrologer, just go to aspnj.org and you'll find the information on the class. The class will be held from noon to 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time on Sundays, again from October 15th through December 3rd. Also, please feel free to email me at SHERI, that's SHERI, at karmicevolution.com if you have questions about whether this class is right for you. Finally, I'm reminding everyone that I will be lecturing at the Astrobas Conference, an evolutionary astrology get-together taking place from September 28th through October 1st in Borrego Springs, California. This conference includes talks by such well-known astrologers as Lynn Bell, Maurice Fernandez, Kay Taylor, and Armand Diaz, and a special keynote presentation by Stephen Forrest. My topic is the fight for women's equality in America, the history of the U.S. Sibley Chart's Chiron return, women's rights, and the 2024 U.S. presidential election. So if you're in the area in Southern Cal, you might want to check it out, but if not, there's also a streaming option where you can avail yourself of to find out more, to enjoy the conference actually virtually from the comfort of your own home. So all you need to do is go to astro-bash.com for more information or to register. All right, so now let's get into this week's astro news you can use. The Virgo new moon occurred last night at 21 degrees and 59 minutes of the sign of Virgo at 6:40 p.m. Pacific Time and 9:40 p.m. Eastern Time on September 14th, calling us to be of greater service to ourselves first and others second by taking care of the health of our own physical bodies so that we may create a stronger foundational sense of inner security that will allow us to ward off any health issues. And here I'm speaking about both personal and collective health, or societal health if you prefer. But first, I'd like to take a look back at what's occurred during the waning portion of this month's lunar cycle since the August 30th Pisces full moon lunation, so that we can see more clearly now how that actually played out in real time. If you remember, that lunation pitted the Pisces moon and Saturn against the Virgo sun, creating a kind of Saturnian blockage to both self-expression, Saturn opposite the sun, and emotional expression, the moon and sun conjunct I'm sorry, the moon and Saturn conjunct. The moon was opposite the sun. So what we have seen during these past 2 weeks, or what have we seen during these past 2 weeks since that Pisces full moon, as the second half of the monthly lunar cycle was waning, that Pisces moon, at the Pisces full moon, wanted to feel and emote. And Neptune ruled Pisces, remember, can be extremely empathic, so it feels other people's emotions. But Saturn, which represents the spine in medical astrology, represents rigidity, which often results in blockages. So here we have the potential for emotional blockages. As Saturn is retrograde in Pisces, we're tasked with reviewing where such blockages exist, why they exist, and how we might introduce more flexibility into our ways of thinking. And that's especially true because Saturn represents also the empirical physical world, while Neptune's Pisces contains within it all of the amorphous, unspoken, visual, right brain, if you will, seeds of the creative process. When the moon conjoined Saturn at that lunation in Pisces, its ability to be empathic, to feel the pain of another or others, became blocked. However, the message the world has received between then and yesterday's Virgo new moon is that if you think you can block out collective energies, including energies that affect the collective, such as those that have given rise to climate change catastrophes, the likes of which we've seen this year, then think again. If you think you can build a wall around your beliefs and guard them by posting a sentinel outside your ego boundaries, even though meanwhile the waters are rising around you, think again. If you think you can keep people out because you fear their differences instead of embracing them as part of the human race, well, my friend, think again. So the symbolism in this message the universe is trying to communicate seems so obvious to me because it lies in the floodwaters and other natural disasters we've witnessed specifically over the past 2 weeks since that Pisces full moon. Now, it's not that we haven't experienced drought, fires, and floods before that. You know, the Lahaina fire, which, however, drove people into the ocean, right? So again, we have that Piscean component. It's not, again, it's not that we haven't experienced these things. Rather, it's that so many coming so close together not only asks us to change our point of view about the fact that so much damage has been done, that climate change is no longer a given. It's also destined to prove catastrophic. So Mother Nature is talking to us loudly and clearly. But the deal here, too, is that, the empathy that comes naturally to the Piscean archetype, if it's been blocked, let them pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, people are lazy, they don't want to work, and that's why they go on Medicaid, and con the system, etc., etc. My point here is that Mother Nature is talking to us loudly and clearly in order to get us to understand that we must feel empathy for everyone and everything, including nature. However, if, like Saturn, we refuse to acknowledge the facts, the symbology of which appeared at the Pisces full moon lunation, since Saturn not only conjoined again with that Pisces moon and blocked its empathic energies, it also opposed the Virgo sun, and all of Virgo's facts, archetypal ability to discern facts, fell on deaf ears. In other words, Saturn held the Pisces moon hostage while it simultaneously prevented the sun from rescuing her. And so now the world is held hostage by our collective results of ignoring Mother Nature yet again. And what's happened since is symbolic as well of the fact that Saturn cannot block us from greater consciousness forever. The proof, as they say, is always in the pudding. So think of the dams that have burst as Saturn's walls have failed to keep the water within. Of course, dams serve a positive purpose. However, they've clearly outlived their usefulness as the force of Piscean waters breached Saturn's rigid structures in its desire to be able to flow freely. And again, Saturn's the metaphor for our ego, Pisces and Neptune the metaphor for our unconscious, our ability to tap into collective energy. So those of us who can understand this on a higher level now have the opportunity to see it for what it really represents. That old structures must fall away as they no longer do the job, because the definitions of quote unquote the job have changed. And those new definitions require a rebuilding and reorientation of our egoic thought processes, which must become more flexible, especially as Pluto heads toward its final entrance back into Aquarius for the next 20 years, beginning by late November of 2024. Since Pluto always says change or be changed, between now and then lies the time period for this adjustment to the future, even though we may not know exactly what that will be right now. So under these astrological auspices, and as that August 30th Pisces full moon was waxing toward fullness, the world experienced the following. And bear in mind, this is by no means a complete listing. So this is right before and then between that full moon and yesterday's Virgo new moon, which started a whole new cycle. So Hurricane Idalia in parts of Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia here in the States, and flash flooding in West Virginia, prompted so much devastation that there were, it spread from Florida, right, because the hurricane moved northward to South Carolina and Georgia, and flash flooding in West Virginia, where there were between 3 and 6 inches of rain, and that was less than what they got in Florida and South Carolina. It went all the way up to near to Charleston, where dozens of homes were badly damaged, prompting the rescue of dozens of people. And according to the Associated Press, by September 12th, quote, Massachusetts City, now we're talking about a completely different portion of this country, right, got nearly 10 inches of rain in 6 hours, flooding homes and eroding dams. Leominster, Massachusetts, experienced heavy rainfall that flooded parts of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, with 2 communities declaring a state of emergency as water poured into homes and forced boat rescues of residents. Concern about a dam listed in poor condition led to more evacuations. Weather officials described the rainfall as, quote, a 200-year event. Up to 300 people were evacuated by Tuesday morning in Leominster, about 40 miles northwest of Boston. Mayor Dean Mazzarella said that included residents of a high-rise apartment building and a nursing home. All schools were closed and 2 shelters were open, but Mazzarella said the city has not seen such widespread damage since a hurricane in 1936. He said most buildings downtown flooded and some collapsed, and rail service into Boston also was disrupted. And the New York Times ran this headline on September 12th as well. Quote, Massachusetts cities declare emergency under catastrophic flash flooding. It's not every part of the city, said the mayor of Leominster, in the central part of the state. It's basements, roofs, cars, everywhere. And I remind you, he said high-rise apartments, right? So if we go back a little further to September 7th, just 24 hours after the third quarter lunar square of the Gemini moon to the Virgo sun on September 6th, which represented the 3/4 way in the monthly lunar cycle, a week after that Pisces full moon, a 6.8 magnitude Morocco earthquake quote, killed thousands of people and devastated parts of Marrakesh and communities south of the major city. The powerful quake sent people throughout the country rushing into the streets as buildings crumbled, creating an immense need for aid. Now think of a stream of people dashing out of their homes or their places of business or their other buildings, hospitals, whatever, right? And think of it as the rush of water, all right? It's metaphor here that I'm going for in symbology. So anyway, this is according to CBS News, and 20 minutes after the main earthquake, a magnitude 4.9 aftershock hit the region. So the quake, which killed more than 3,000 people and injured more than 5,500, quote, had a depth of about 16 miles, which the U.S. Geological Survey Agency considers to be relatively shallow, according to CBS. Shaking was reported throughout the country as well as in Algeria, Portugal, and Spain. And according to the USGS, the earthquake was the result of oblique reverse faulting. As Jesus Galindo Zalvidar, a professor of geodynamics at the Universidad de Granada, told the conversation that the phenomenon happens when tectonic plates collide, causing stress to build on a fault line as the Earth's crust thickens. When rocks abruptly shift to release the stress, it can cause an earthquake. And on September 11th, the New York Times reported that, quote, UNICEF said that about 100,000 children have been impacted by the earthquake in Morocco, including losing access to their homes or schools. Now, homes and schools are foundational structures that provide security, right? I mean, as we come into this conflict between Piscean energy that wants to flow and move, they're rushed out of, or Saturn says, okay, we're blocking off the access. It's I don't know. To me, it just seems so clear. Anyway, it was still unclear how many children were among the more than 3,000 people killed. Again, according to the New York Times. And on September 14th, the New York Times likewise ran this story, quote, in a catastrophe recalling Hurricane Katrina, a heavy storm burst through dams. Are you picking up the references to dams here and to people rushing like water? To unleash their waters on the city of Derna, Libya, sweeping away entire neighborhoods. More than 5,000 people were killed in Libya after torrential rains caused two dams, again, to burst near the coastal city of Derna, destroying much of the city and carrying entire neighborhoods into the sea. Remember I mentioned Lahaina. People were forced to run into the sea to get away from the fire. Local authorities said on Tuesday. Now, Libya, a northern African nation, the Times continues, splintered by a war, was ill-prepared for the storm called Daniel, which swept across the Mediterranean Sea to batter its coastline. The country is administered by two rival governments, complicating rescue and aid efforts, and despite its vast oil resources, its infrastructure had been poorly maintained after more than a decade of political chaos. And the article goes on, in the city of Derna alone, at least 5,200 people died, said Tarek Al-Kharez, a spokesman for the Interior Ministry of the government that oversees eastern Libya, according to the Libyan television station Al-Masar. But the floodwaters also swept through other eastern settlements, including Shahat, Al-Baida, and Marj, and at least 20,000 people were displaced. 10,000 more were missing, and the death toll is likely to continue to rise, even now. The flooding left bodies scattered in the streets, while buckling buildings, again Saturn, sinking vehicles, and blocking roads, impeding access to the most stricken areas. End quote. Less impactful, but still of note, was this, as reported by the New York Times on September 12th too, but this incident occurred on September 10th. And here I quote, two tanks holding nearly 600,000 gallons, about 2.2 million liters, of wine at a distillery in Portugal collapsed on Sunday, sending a torrent of red wine down the streets of the small town of Levira. One tank, opened at the top, collapsed because of a, quote, structured failure, said Pedro Carvalho, the chief executive of the distillery, in the Portuguese municipality of Anadia, about 140 miles north of Lisbon. The sheer force of the wine knocked over another tank, causing the wine from both tanks to flow out of the distillery and into the streets. Again, Pisces represents not only liquid, things that flow, but it also has a connotation with things we use to escape, like alcohol. So, the authorities, the article goes on, are investigating the cause of the collapse, and Mr. Carvalho said it looked like a river, and noted that there was not a strong smell in the air afterward because it was, quote, good quality wine. And, there's a little Saturnian kind of satire in that, right? I'm very proud of our wine. We produce good wine. Our reputation is to produce good wine. And so I'm assuming that the people of Lyra have a good sense of humor. Anyway, the spill didn't last for more than an hour, and the local volunteer fire department helped clean up the roads, and no injuries were reported, thank God. But some of this and what I've mentioned before brings me back again to the fact that Mars in Libra since August 27th, and where it will be through October 12th, has thus far highlighted where partnerships have not been in alignment or brought us new alignments altogether. Last week I noted that this can manifest as, quote, the enemy of my enemy is my friend kinds of partnerships, which would seem to be true, as this week North Korean dictator Kim Jong-Un met with Russia's autocrat Vladimir Putin as well to try to trade technological secrets for weapons which Russia is in desperate need of. So I will let everybody Google that on their own, but that was a big story that you may or may not have already apprised yourself of the facts. Also, and again, this is not the only story applicable to the Mars and Libra energy, in my opinion. My referencing the Moroccan catastrophe via earthquake, the Moroccan government, after experiencing this devastating earthquake, decided to decline aid from all but 4 countries: Spain, the United Kingdom, Qatar, and the United Arab Emirates. And they rejected offers of help from France, even though France has still maintains it's ready to help, and from many other countries, including the United States and Germany, along with Canada, Turkey, and Algeria, which have also offered aid that has not been accepted so far. So I would point out that Morocco was colonized by France, and as Algeria was too. So the fact that there's bad blood between Morocco and France isn't really lost on a lot of the citizens there. Now, the G20 summit also occurred during this period on September 9th, and leaders meeting in India, quote, reached consensus earlier than expected at their summit, issuing a broad economic plan for poorer nations. But divisions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine remained, according to the New York Times. Again, more Mars and Libra, whose side are you really on kind of stuff. Speaking of which, the story also broke this past week about Michael Isakov's new book about Elon Musk, that Elon Musk turned off the Starlink satellites last year in order to prevent the Ukrainian military from attacking Russian ships near Odessa with drones. Musk is quoted as saying in the book that allowing the Ukrainians to do so would have enabled a, quote, mini Pearl Harbor, and thus further escalate the war. And that brings up the whole what side of this dispute between former partners, meaning Russia and Ukraine, which used to be united under the USSR banner, is the richest man in the world who controls technological communication devices on. And I'll let everyone do their own research on the exact details of this story and discuss among yourselves. But meanwhile, all this juggling of partnerships, including the U.S. courting Saudi Arabia currently as they announced a cutback in oil production, represents a realignment of the New World Order, which I'd say is related to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn, which occurred back in January of 2020. Now, the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in Libra in late 1982 and early 1983, and that gave rise to the economic austerity movement, not only with the advent of Ronald Reagan as U.S. president, but eventually around the world as the trickle-down and starve-the-beast economic policies began to become enacted. Eventually, such governmental austerity, or cutting back of federal services to citizens, especially here in the U.S., citizens in favor of corporate free market policies taking the lead, led to government defaults in places like Greece, whose economy suffered for years. So the point there is that, that was the beginning of decentralization of the federal government and placing more authority in the hands of the states. And look where we are now, once we passed the Dobbs decision in June of 2022 about denying women physical bodily autonomy and placing it not in the Roe versus Wade constitutional amendment that got abolished, but by remanding it to each individual state. So, more on that another time. But before that, it was the last Saturn-Pluto conjunction was in Leo, and it was circa 1947, and that gave rise to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, in the post-World War II environment of shifting global alliances. So I point out, just to do the math, that the Saturn-Pluto cycle after the two planets conjoin lasts about 36 to 37 years each cycle. Now let's turn to the fact that Jupiter's retrograde in Taurus since September 4th and will remain so until December 30th, and that Jupiter, which rules the ninth house naturally, represents the law, among other things, and Uranus, also currently retrograde in Taurus, rules the 11th house of the legislature in the natural chart. So on September 12th, the Associated Press reported that House Speaker Kevin McCarthy, quote, announced Tuesday he is directing the U.S. House to open an impeachment inquiry into President Joe Biden over his family's business dealings, launching historic proceedings ahead of the 2024 election, end quote. And just hours before the Virgo new moon, yesterday, September 14th, the Department of Justice indicted Hunter Biden, the president's son, charging him, according to the New York Times, with lying to federal prosecutors, quote, about his drug use when he purchased a handgun in 2018 and with illegally possessing the weapon, setting up the potential for a trial coinciding with his father's re-election campaign. The article continues, the indictment came as House Republicans stepped up their efforts to use Hunter Biden's work abroad to build a case for impeaching President Biden, and it puts the Biden Justice Department in the remarkable position of prosecuting cases against both the president's son and former President Donald J. Trump, the current frontrunner for the Republican Party's 2024 presidential nomination. Now, the former of that, I think, is also some Mars in Libra stuff, right? It's like, let's indict, let's go to war, in a sense, against someone who's partnered with one particular side. But we might note also that as we approached yesterday's Virgo new moon, Mercury in Virgo, the ruler of this lunation, is virtually motionless, preparing to station direct at 8 degrees and 4 minutes of Virgo on September 15th, which is today. So if you missed last week's podcast, please try to go back and have a listen, since I outlined in detail, that's the September 8th podcast, what we might expect between Mercury's station direct and in the immediate future. Now, however, let's look a little more closely at the Virgo new moon's energies, since we're still in the early stages, since it occurred, again, just last night on September 14th. Now, I want to point out also, as part of your astrological education, that the Virgo archetype is numbers driven, in addition to its other archetypal connotations about being discerning and taking the information that Gemini collects and analyzing it and slotting it and categorizing it and evaluating it and then coming up with a conclusion. And it's based mostly on provable factual information, that the Virgo archetype is also numbers driven. And we find it prevalent in those who like geometry. So remember, there's such a thing as sacred geometry as per the ancients. And according to Wikipedia, and here I quote, sacred geometry ascribes symbolic and sacred meanings to certain geometric shapes and certain geometric proportions. It is associated with the belief of a divine creator of the universal geometer. The geometry used in the design and construction of religious structures such as churches, temples, mosques, religious monuments, altars, and tabernacles has sometimes been considered sacred. The concept applies also to sacred spaces such as temeni, sacred groves, village greens, pagodas, and holy wells, mandala gardens, and the creation of religious and spiritual art. The belief that a God created the universe according to a geometric plan has ancient origins. Plutarch attributed the belief to Plato, writing that, quote, Plato said God geometricizes continually, end quote. In modern times, the mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss adapted this quote, saying, quote, God arithmetizes. Johann Kepler, who lived from 1571 to 1630, believed in the geometric underpinnings of the cosmos. And Harvard mathematician Xing-Tong Yao expressed a belief in the centrality of geometry in 2010 thus, quote, lest one conclude that geometry is little more than a well-calibrated ruler, and this is no knock against the ruler, which happens to be a technology I admire, geometry is one of the main avenues available to us for probing the universe. Physics and cosmology have been, almost by definition, absolutely crucial for making sense of the universe. Geometry's role in this may be less obvious, but is equally vital. I would go so far as to say that geometry not only deserves a place at the table alongside physics and cosmology, but in many ways it is the table. Most of us know, and that was an end quote, these are my words, most of us know that astrology is based on geometry because it's based on the division of the circle. And that is what I will be talking about in my aspects class starting October 15th. Wink, wink. But this is how we discern aspects between planets, which then allowed the ancients to delve deeper into watching what happens, as above, so below, right? When certain aspects form between certain planets, and to correlate them with earthly occurrences. And what they noticed is that when certain aspects between certain planets recurred, that the same type of energy would manifest here on Earth. So if we think about this as a basic concept, it really isn't rocket science, right? So as we approached the Virgo new moon yesterday, it appeared that numbers have now taken center stage, and that will be something that will probably stay with us at this lunation. So first, between learning this past week that the rate of inflation has climbed slightly, it is now at 3.7% as consumer prices, including the aforementioned gas, due to the fact that the OPEC decision was to cut back production, which I mentioned earlier, and finding out that child poverty has increased, mostly due to the loss of the child tax credit with the ending of the pandemic era for poorer families, and hearing about budget negotiations being fired up again as the House has returned from its summer recess, we can now see how Virgo will become an important archetypal energy to which to pay attention within the next month. And I would point out as well on the Mars Libra squall room, when we add that to it, the United Auto Workers Union strike had a deadline of last night at 11:59 p.m., just after the Virgo new moon, whereby 350,000 employees were threatening to strike. Now, I am recording this before that time, so unfortunately, as much as I like to be up to the minute with news, it's not a possibility. So the United Auto Workers president, Shawn Fain, said on September 13th that offers from the companies aren't enough and the union is getting ready to strike. In an online address to union members, he said that General Motors, Ford, and Stellantis have raised their initial wage offers but have rejected some of the union's other demands. We do not yet have offers on the table that reflect the sacrifices and contributions our members have made to these companies, he said. To win, we're likely going to have to take action. We are preparing to strike these companies in a way they've never seen before. Now, according to the New York Times, also on the 13th of September, with a headline, "Economic impact of an auto strike could be felt nationwide." Now, it is possible that by tomorrow morning this will all be over, but I do not yet know. So the Times says an extended walkout by the United Auto Workers in a contract dispute could raise car prices and affect jobs at the company's suppliers. 2 years after the auto industry survived the supply chain upheaval of the pandemic, another disruption, the prospective strike by the United Auto Workers, threatens to upend the production and distribution of new cars, and the impact could be wide-ranging. The UAW strike against one or more of Detroit's big three, Ford Motors, General Motors, and Stellantis, as I said, which owns Chrysler, Jeep, and Ram, is likely to quickly affect the U.S. economy, particularly in the Midwest. After a prolonged strike by crimping the availability of new vehicles, a prolonged strike by crimping the availability of new vehicles could lead to soaring car prices. The combination of slower growth and higher prices could complicate matters for the Federal Reserve, which has sought to bring down inflation, which I just mentioned has been rising, while maintaining job growth. And according to an August report from the Anderson Economic Group, a 10-day strike against all three automakers would result in total economic losses of $5.6 billion. Around $3.5 billion of that would result from lost wages and production, with the remaining $2.1 billion borne by consumers who wouldn't be able to get necessary repairs and replacement parts, and by dealers and their employees. And I mentioned, too, that this past week, as we lead up to this numbers-oriented, let me say, too, Mercury's stationing direct, right, today. So Mercury is transportation. Hello. And on the other financial news side that deals with numbers, the New York and Oregon states' pension funds announced this week that they're suing Fox News over, quote, neglecting its fiduciary duty to shareholders by allowing conspiracy theories that made Fox the target of several defamation suits. So, again, part of this is Jupiter's retrograde energy, reviewing all of the details of legal cases and legal cases involving numbers. So, Jupiter's retrograde, we would think that expansion tends to stop. That could be related to this auto workers union strike. Could be, production will stop. Jupiter and Taurus normally would be a how much is too much energy, and the answer would be no much. But retrograde, it appears, at least thus far, that it's far less expansive, or should I say generous in energy. So, that is playing out in a lot of these legal cases as well, where recently, this past week also, I think it was Monday, that Mark Meadows, who tried to move his trial from Georgia court system, state court system, to federal court, which would not be televised, and that really is the only major difference, because it would remain a state case, not a federal one, would be in danger of not being able to be open to the general public. As I mentioned, in terms of the legal cases in Georgia against Mark Meadows, he was unable to move his trial to the quote-unquote higher dimension, Jupiter, of federal court, where, of course, it, as I said, wouldn't be televised. But, we also have the assumption at this point by many legal pundits that the Georgia trial will, in fact, happen for all of the accused at the same time. Again, that's a numbers thing, right? Not sure what this means for the already granted speedy trials for Ken Chesbrough and Sidney Powell by the judge who says they can be tried together beginning October 23rd, but there's speculation that the trials may be split into two, but not more, with either those two or maybe one others with them relegated to a faster trial while everyone else will still be tried together at a later date, possibly as late as the beginning of next year, which I think it's March 4th, right, is the date, which is the day before the Super Tuesday. So lawyer Tim Heffy, who was the lead investigator for the January 6th committee in the House, said there are times when you have trials like these when the rights of different defendants conflict. And so he's saying, the question of the court will be which of these rights wins. So the speedy trial may be set behind for a later trial date when the other defendants are appropriately ready sometime next year. And he said, in addition, a trial of 19 defendants is quite cumbersome. I'd be surprised if they all stayed together, but certainly not 3 or 4 or 5 trials. So he claims that, or estimates, we're probably headed for some kind of hybrid where some may not get as speedy a trial as they want, but more of the defendants will be tried together. Now, we also have the U.S. House budget negotiations currently, whereby a new fiscal budget for 2024 either must be voted on and or an agreement must be made to temporarily extend the current budget by the end of this month or September 30th. Again, numbers will matter significantly now as the GOP attempts to renegotiate an already negotiated agreement which took place prior to the summer recess. Now, as I noted last week, Virgo is the archetypal sign that most strives for perfection. One of its downsides is, of course, not realizing that there is no such thing and that attempting to achieve perfection can lead us instead to feel badly about ourselves because we'll never feel we measure up. So when we try to be perfect, we often also demand perfection from those around us. And it's only when we stop to think about it that we can realize that our need for perfection actually stems from an unconscious insecurity that the bottom may fall out at any minute based on our inability to control our environment. Combined with Saturn retrograde in Pisces, this may factor into how rigidly resistant hardliners in the GOP remain throughout this budget negotiation process, possibly even into an actual government shutdown. We know there are hardliners, as I said. The old Freedom Caucus morphed into the new Freedom Caucus, whatever its name is. So as the Virgo new moon waxes now, it's a good to remember that our emphasis should be less on controlling everyone and everything around us, especially through things like finances and financial numbers, but rather on being of service. In the case of Congress, that's of service to those who put you there. But when I say that, I also mean being of service to ourselves first, which is something I indicated last week. Like the cliche that we must put on our own oxygen masks first when the plane is going down, else how can we be of any good to others if we've passed out from a lack of oxygen as we attempt to help them place their masks on properly? And an earth sign, Virgo, like Taurus and Capricorn, is about the physical world, and so it's about our bodies. And one of the ways to take care of both is to be aware of what's going on both inside and outside of us. Now, potential new solutions to old problems may occur as the Virgo sun perfects its trine to Uranus and Taurus on September 15th, just after the Virgo new moon, and with Mercury stationed direct in Virgo, which can then provide clarity as communication and technical snafus should begin now to clear up. And Venus is square to Jupiter September 16th or 17th can be a how much is too much dilemma. So on the personal level, shopping with friends is great, but buying out the store, not so much. So watch for overreach on the part of elected officials as well when we're talking about this budget stuff. I think they passed, the House passed, the GOP dominated House passed the ability for them to introduce something like 145 amendments to this budget bill. So they're going to waste a lot of time. Which, by the way, reminds me also that Mitt Romney announced September 13th during the waxing portion of this lunar cycle that he won't seek re-election to the U.S. Senate in 2024. Now, perhaps he's consciously realized that his party's attempts to build walls rather than bridges is really an ego battle that he no longer wants to engage in, because he knows that simply continuing to build walls represents the GOP's ego's soul-conditioned, rigid resistance to block out any intuitive knowing, and that sooner or later that dam's going to burst. So the Virgo sun then forms an earthy trine to Pluto in Capricorn late September 20th or early the 21st, providing an easier path for some type of financial assistance. Remember, Pluto represents joint resources to those who need it. Read victims of natural disasters, etc. It's also a good time to take up any investigative study, one which delves into the heart of any matter, as well as a time of empowerment for finding out what's necessary to know in order to effect any necessary social reforms. And the sun then enters Libra late on September 22nd or early on the 23rd, depending on your time zone, and the monthly tone begins to shift to one that will strive for more harmonious balance. Libra's archetypally the diplomat, and where there's a lot of that going on always, especially within personal relationships, but also within domestic and global partnerships, we may expect to see more sympathy and empathy for victims of any kind, as Venus in Leo also trines wounded healer Chiron in Aries. Now, Venus in Leo also likes drama, but is also proud of its partnerships since Venus rules Libra. So helping under the auspices of the Virgo new moon's waxing energy, those who need it most, is also a strong possibility. And I'm thinking, too, about the fact that, and this factors into the budget negotiations now, the economy is going to change, and these statistics about inflation, etc., because student loan debt repayments will resume, and that ending, like I said before, of the child tax credit, people are going to have a lot less money. If we have strikes also by the UAW, or the still ongoing, continuing writers' strike in Hollywood that the actors have joined, their union, SAG-AFTRA. I mean, these things are still ongoing, and they still will have an effect on the overall economy. So anyway, and in terms of, I was just thinking that this may, in fact, bode well for the Ukrainians, though, especially in terms of the U.S. budget negotiations in the House, but we'll see, because, of course, they include supplying the Ukrainians with more financial assistance, where, of course, that small group of hardliners in the GOP are resistant to that. People like, Marjorie Taylor Greene and Matt Gaetz, right? So when Mars in Libra opposes Chiron retrograde in Aries, though, and the Libra sun quincunxes Saturn retrograde in Pisces on September 24th, we may well need to adjust to others' complaints or blockages to our ability to do so, again, either on a personal or more collective level. And September 25th's earthy Mercury in Virgo trine to Jupiter retrograde in Taurus may lead us to take the easy way out. I'm thinking here of how the U.S. budget negotiations may include, because that'll be 5 days before their September 30th deadline, how they may include, in fact, a temporary extension, since the government will run out of money again on September 30th. In other words, in haste, the House may extend the budget temporarily, but in the meantime, there are some, things that would actually make payments on if they allow the government to go into default. I mean, all right, that wasn't very clear, was it? Mercury's going to trine Jupiter. Jupiter is retrograde, so it's more contraction-oriented than expansion-oriented. So it's unlikely that we'll get a new budget agreement. Mercury, meanwhile, has stationed direct, and by then we'll be gaining some speed. It'll be 10 days later from its station direct point, and there may be some progress there to keep the budget as is temporarily, as opposed to allowing the economy to go into default, especially considering some of these other factors I just mentioned, like the pending auto workers strike and the current Hollywood writers strikes. All right, so I think I've overstayed my welcome by now, and I tried to pack in a lot of information, so forgive me if I sped through some of it. But, you know, when you're writing this stuff, all these different thoughts come into my head, and then I have to go back and organize them all so that they are coherent to anyone who is listening to me. So thank you again, everyone, for joining me today. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week on September 22nd for another episode of Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book.